Hi everyone, we're back with lecture number 8 on medieval Russia up through the 19th century. Now, well before there was a centralized state known as Russia, there existed in much of northeastern Europe and Central Asia a series of trading towns. The residents of these regions that are highlighted in pink here on the map to the north of the Byzantine Empire. The residents of these towns were trying to eke out a living in sometimes a quite hostile environment. If you're familiar with the weather in this area of the world, you're talking about bitterly cold winters, harsh summers. Adding to their problems were the Viking invasions of the 9th century, as Scandinavians under their ruler Oleg in 882 gained control of one of these key trading centers, the city of Kiev. Oleg's rule over Kiev marked the first establishment of a unified dynastic state in the region. And coming back to our map here, you can see Kiev here towards the south. There will be a number of strategic trading routes that will crisscross this region, connecting it from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea and ultimately the Mediterranean in the south. So early Russia comes from the Kievan Rus, as the empire came to be known. Raids by invading peoples over the centuries, including the Mongols in 1237, the Kipchuks later than that, and then finally the Swedes, will lead to a great deal of political fragmentation in this region. When the Mongols were finally expelled in the 15th century, we still see a series of internal struggles to create a unified state, in particular from the power of the boyars or the nobility in this region. They were loath to give up their regional power to any one leader. That will change under the harsh rule of Ivan IV, who also earns the nickname Ivan the Terrible. Ivan likely ruled with such an iron fist because he experienced a number of tragedies early in his life. His father passed away when he was but 3 years old, and then the landed nobility, known as the boyars, took over many areas, denying Ivan's right to the throne. His mother was later poisoned by political rivals, and basically he was treated kind of as a political pawn passed around over the years. So when Ivan was finally able to grow into adulthood and marshal his own military forces, he's going after the nobility, these people that had tortured him for years. After defeating the boyars in battle, his power became absolute when he succeeded in conquering the remaining independent principalities, such as Siberia, and ejected the last of the Mongols. So once more, we have the example of a king who needs to build his own armies so that he can keep the nobility at bay. Ivan will then go on to build up a centralized bureaucracy in the city of Moscow, introducing a reformed code of laws and a new system of justice. He will also help to strengthen the exploitative labor system known as serfdom, which we'll explain more about in just a few minutes. Ivan also created an ominous police force to hunt out suspected enemies. Tens of thousands of citizens that were suspected of rebelling against him were killed. Men, women, and children tied to sleighs, which were then run into freezing waters of the rivers. Mass public executions took place in Novgorod and in other areas. Even his own family was not spared his terrible temper. He earns his nickname, the Terrible, for good reason. After his death, we will see that successive leaders will also struggle with trying to unite these many different factions underneath one single leadership. Russia by 1600 was still very much a medieval society, one that was dominated by the power of the king or the czar. Notice the different spellings of that here on the slide. The nobility or the boyars, also notice that term here on the slide, also still wielded a tremendous amount of power despite Ivan the Terrible's attempts to cripple them. The Russian Orthodox Church, the Christian Church, was also a factor in society. There was essentially no separation of church and state in Russia during this period. The church simply encouraged everyone, including peasants and serfs, to simply accept their lot in life, with their reward supposedly in the next life. Speaking of serfdom, we need to spend a few minutes talking about this exploitative labor system. Basically, if you were a serf, you were a landless, poor farmer that was legally bound to work someone else's land from generation to generation. In other words, your kids inherited this legal obligation to stay in the same place, to work for someone with no wages being given to you, and produce wealth that only someone else could enjoy. Serfs also held very few rights. They could be beaten or raped at will by the landowners. And this terrible system is what was reinforced under Ivan IV. So by 1600, politically, Russia was still a relatively small state, centered largely around the city of Moscow, only developing slowly after coming out from under several centuries worth of Mongol domination. However, what we're going to see is the direction of growth for Russia will be eastward, moving into what we think of as present-day Siberia. This is the direction that military forces will be moving into on behalf of the Russian monarchy for the next couple of centuries. However, this won't be a peaceful process. As Russia continues to expand eastward, they will encounter hundreds of different tribal societies with different languages, different ethnicities, hunter-gatherer societies, herding societies, many of them without access to more modern weaponry. And the Russian government encouraged this eastward settlement for some of the same reasons, actually, that, for example, the United States encouraged westward settlement as the nation grew, to make money off of trade with locals, to, quote, civilize and Christianize, unquote, the native peoples. But unfortunately, as I said, this will not be a peaceful process. It will be a sustained military takeover of many of these peoples, who will then be forced into a position of relative serfdom. In the cold forests of Siberia, for example, this meant that locals had to produce large quantities of furs and send them westward to Moscow, enriching the coffers of the monarchy while locals were paid a pittance. Other areas were mined for their mineral wealth. For the Russian state, this worked out beautifully. For the native peoples in this region, they are being exploited. By the late 17th century, while we will continue to see Russia expanding geographically to the east, we will also see a leader by the name of Peter the Great looking westward in a bid to modernize his country. So Peter the Great will be looking in two directions, looking eastward to conquer and to plunder those regions for their wealth, but looking west to emulate many European countries such as Britain, France, and the German territories. He's very much fascinated by the West, culturally speaking. He spent a great deal of time as a youth being trained by tutors and advisors in Western Europe. He will travel around the continent in disguise, observing their shipyards, for example, their advanced shipbuilding techniques. He's going to be very interested in the development of much more modern and deadlier weapons technology as he visits those countries. He will also take note of their roads and canals and other infrastructure and educational improvements that he's seeing in Western Europe. When he returns back to Russia, he wants his country to enjoy many of those same benefits. Along these lines, we will see that mirroring Western culture, he will modernize the Russian alphabet. He will introduce the Julian calendar that was used in Western Europe. He'll establish the first Russian newspaper. The first printing press will be introduced under his rule in Russia. Russian noblemen, as well as soldiers, were now ordered to wear Western-inspired European clothing and to shave their traditional beards, which was considered to be too Asian-looking. This created a tremendous amount of resentment, as you might expect. Many people saying, why should I have to dress or look like someone in London or Paris? I live in Russia. He will oversee the creation of a new capital city named St. Petersburg, named after him, of course, and he will call it his window to the West. In particular, we'll see that he will take firm command of Russian military forces. He will help to strengthen and expand the military once more. This is in a bid to support his absolutist rule and reduce the power of the nobility. After his death, his grandson will end up taking over power, Peter III, but it will be Peter III's wife, Catherine the Great, that will come to wield the most authority. Catherine, by the way, was not even from Russia. She was a German princess who married into the Russian nobility by marrying Peter III. Catherine wrote later of her loveless marriage to Peter III, saying, quote, "After the dogs, I was the most miserable creature in the world." 7 years after their wedding, she still had not given birth to a new heir. Their marriage was tragic from the get-go. When Peter III was crowned ruler of Russia in 1761, he quickly proved to be a very unpopular and inept sovereign. He was somewhat immature and childlike, and his German wife was more popular than he was. Ultimately, Catherine is going to realize that she needed to maneuver herself into a position of power. So we'll end up seeing that Peter will ultimately be arrested by troops that are now loyal to Catherine. He will die in their custody, and she will become the Queen of Russia. And as Empress, she will end up ruling for 30 years. That's the longest of any female ruler in Russian history. Catherine was also very similar to Peter the Great, very much influenced by Western European culture and the arts. Having grown up in the German territories, she loved literature. She wrote fiction herself, comedies and memoirs. She corresponded with French intellectuals, including the Enlightenment philosophes such as Diderot, D'Alembert, and Voltaire, the latter of whom she exchanged ideas with for over 15 years. As a result, when we talk about Catherine the Great's rule, we speak of her being an enlightened, absolutist monarch. What this means is she will introduce a series of reforms. She will sponsor the arts and literature. And so to the outsider, she might look like someone who was very much influenced by the Enlightenment movement. For example, she helped to revise Russia's legal system and propose a series of laws which would provide equal protection to all persons under the law. Here are some excerpts, for instance, from Catherine the Great's proposals for a new law code. You can see that in section number 34, she's talking about all be subject to the same laws. She wants to do away with the usage of torture. And all of this seems very much influenced, as I said, by the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment influence of some of her correspondents, such as Voltaire. She will also extend religious toleration to people of different faiths within her realm, as well as support several educational reforms, including the founding of a number of new schools. However, the phrase enlightened absolutist, we need to focus now on the second part of that, the absolutist part of her reign. She was, after all, interested in preserving her power and her power alone. So, for this reason, she devoted quite a bit of attention to the military forces of Russia. And during her reign, Russia achieved great military success, acquiring large tracts of land to the empire, especially following two successful wars against the Ottoman Empire, in which Russia annexed Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula, which gave it access to the Black Sea. Make no mistake about it, though, this army was not only successful at defeating foreign foes, she made sure that the nobility understood that it could be used against them as well, should they decide to challenge her authority. So through the reigns of both Peter the Great as well as Catherine the Great, we will see that Russia will undergo an intensive period of rapid modernization during the 17th and 18th centuries. Yet while Russia will modernize in many different ways, better infrastructure, improved military, educational reforms, in many respects Russia will still remain a society kind of frozen with in its class distinctions. And we'll talk more about that as we move forward in class and pick up with our story about Russia on the eve of World War I.